a chéir gur mír mágat as na deafachail sin agus an fáilte chuir tú Róm. Agus tá sé bhlam sa chéaddul sios mo bhuichas a go bháil dáine agus de chuiste na dismóirí an seo an éan an chuire seo a thuirtam leabhart ag cógáil mar an seo. Níl gur cógáil bliain tú le ach go bhfuil tuistaí ón tíre eile sa Eorpach ling chomá. Friends, I've just said in our first official language, or our native language, a very warm thank you to the committee of the National Parents' Council for inviting me here, particularly on the occasion when you're hosting the General Assembly of the European Parents Associations, some of whom I've met at some of the presidency conferences as well. It's good to see some familiar faces. And I hope you've enjoyed the assembly here. I hope you'll be back as well, because it's always good for the economy here, but also it's good to share the ideas. Now, when Anya asked me to talk, she's not a woman to ask for small things, really. And she asked me, would I, in a sense, reflect on how parental involvement in education has developed here in Ireland. Because in some respects, parental involvement advanced and has advanced quite a considerable degree in Ireland, and in some cases certainly knowing from my European colleagues, perhaps in advance of how that progress has happened in some European countries. And in other respects, we still have an awful lot to do. So what I'm going to do is to reflect on how that has developed. Now, those of you who know me and know that there is a history background in me, I promise this is not a long history lesson, okay? But there is a bit of it, because I think we do need to see the perspective of where we're at today in the context of where we've come from, because there are lessons along that road. And while I'll talk about some aspects of the history of how it has developed, I'm not pretending that this is a proper comprehensive history of parental involvement in Ireland, though it might be no harm if somebody actually was commissioned to write that up at some stage. I want to really, though, ask some questions at the end of that part. At national level, what are some of the successes and what are some of the challenges that remain in that? And then to turn to the local, to how it actually transacts on the ground for a parent in an individual school. And in all of this, I'm coming at it from the point of view of different pieces of my own experience about parental involvement, though I'm almost afraid to use that word after Joyce this morning. But bear with me, if you will. I'm still stuck in that language. Because I've been obviously a student in the system, I was a teacher, I was the principal of a school, and then I ended up for a period training teachers in colleges, in a college of education and a university. I've been in curriculum development during the time of the primary school curriculum going on, and now I'm in the inspectorate. And in each of those phases of my life, I've met parents in different roles, and I've ended up being a parent as well, so now I'm back as a customer of the system, which is an interesting perspective as well. So I'm going to use that experience as I go through it. So let me take this is much more on the way our attitude to how parents have been involved in the education system in Ireland. Well, on one level, you know, if you go back to our constitution, not many countries put in as a fundamental part of their constitution that the primary educator of children is the family. But we did in 1937. Now, you could say, my heavens, wasn't that terribly far advanced and far-sighted, and isn't that a really, really good thing to have in your constitution? The truth was, it really was words that meant very little. Because in practice, for most of the 20th century, parents played very little role in their children's education within the schooling system. Of course they did it at home, but within the formal school system, they had very little involvement at all. And part of the reason, though not all of it, was because of the churches that the minister mentioned in one of his question replies. In the 19th century, churches had come to run the primary school or national school system. And for various reasons and struggles with the British administration and so on, they came to be the managers of schools. And when the new state was set up in 1922, the system was left unchanged. So churches founded schools, and the word that we use in Ireland for that founder is patron. So I'm going to sometimes be mentioning the word patron or patronage of schools, and it really means most of the time the church authorities that run the school. And that pattern has still persisted. Most schools are still denominational in Ireland. They're still under the patronage of a particular church in most cases. And of course, what it did was that it meant that parents were not directly involved. In fact, this is an interesting book. This is a book published in the late 1980s. And it was reviewing Irish educational policy. It will be considered the definitive history. Now, I don't know if you can see very clearly, but section 2, which is on the contents page, lists a number of chapters that are headed The Contributors and Contributions to Educational Policy in Ireland, 1900 to 1986. And look who they are: the primary teachers, the post-primary teachers, the managerial bodies, the political parties, the churches, the Minister for Education and the Department of Finance. Not a parent in sight. Now, actually, what it did was it reflected the real lived experience, because that's what the experience is really like. And I think I actually went to the book just when in preparing for this, and I just happened to open the front cover. I said, isn't that the absolute summary of the first part of what I'm saying is? The lack of involvement, the lack even of an acknowledgement of that, despite a constitutional provision that we as parents are the primary educators. And the first signs of that change really didn't come until the 1970s. So you're talking about that changing in the last quarter of the 20th century. And even then, in only a portion of that. We got a new child-centred primary curriculum in 1970. It had been developed in the late 60s, and it really brought a new understanding into public discourse about how children learn and the nature of the environment you have for them, and therefore the role of parents became an obvious talking point. When post-primary education became freely available in 1967, we were quite late as a country to do that. It obviously then unleashed a complete new set of experiences for most Irish people. Most Irish people had never gone to second-level schooling prior to 1970. Very tiny minority had. Now you had a completely, within a few years, a better educated audience, but also an awareness of the importance of opportunity that education brought. And inevitably, parents started to become more interested and more involved in the process. Even the Church's own teaching post-Vatican II allowed for parental involvement in a way it hadn't previously. There's a document, a Catholic document from the bishops here in the 1930s, which say, under no circumstances must parents be in any way involved in the management of schools. And yet, by post-Vatican II, that whole notion of church had changed. And the last element was the founding of schools by parents, which really started with special schools in the 1960s. Now, the history of special education I'm not going to get into, but prior to 1950 and for some years afterwards, special education was woefully neglected in Ireland. And some parents started to campaign for better provision, and they opened a special school, the first of them in 1960. It was St. Michael's House. And what they were doing, like the group of parents in the 1970s who opened non-denominational or schools in which Protestants and Catholics would be educated together, both of them used the theory of the system rather than what had gone before. Because the theory of the Irish school system was that it was mixed. Now, it never had been, ever. But we're quite good at writing something in theory and then saying, oh, that's all very fine, and we'll just leave it to one side. And that's essentially what had happened. The multi-denominational schools, the first of those was the Dalkey Project School in 1974, and there were a number afterwards. And what they came to show was parents themselves could run a school and bring a new perspective to how a school should be run. Now, they were at first very much middle-class parents who did that, because only they really had the resources to do it. But it was a very strong signal that things could change. And the department did start to react. It had published the primary school curriculum in 1970, which was an absolute sea change for the system. And it then decided that it would actually explain it to parents, an unheard of concept before that. You didn't need to know because the school knew better. It was the implicit understanding of the time. Arnalti Illa actually explained the new curriculum and explained what the chances of post-primary education could bring. And then you get a set of attempts to link schools and parents together. So you get visiting teachers. Now they're in the special ed space, first of all, for children who are deaf, who are blind, and then who are an excluded group in Irish society, the travellers. They're a nomadic community who had appalling experiences of the lack of education. And by the 1990s, you got, in disadvantaged areas, homeschool community liaison teachers. In fact, when Joyce was talking, I couldn't help but hear the words and the whole theory and the practice of homeschool community liaison. Even then, even that word, community, that she made such a point of today, was there in 1990. The management of schools, too, came under scrutiny, because people began asking and saying, why can only the school be managed by the local clergyman or the local parish priest? And this was true of Protestant and Catholic denominations. And some schools started to open or to found parent associations in the 1970s. And by 1975, you got a government decision that there would be a board of management for each primary school. That was one in which there were elected parents, elected teachers, as well as representatives of the original founder or patron. And that's the model we still have today. And I know it has an awful lot of problems with it and weaknesses in it, but it is an incredibly important legal involvement and entitlement for parents to be involved in the management of their own school. And it's one that we shouldn't underestimate. The truth was, though, that progress was quite limited. You got this piecemeal progress. And somebody like John Cooler, who is probably the most distinguished historian of education in Ireland, when he looked at the first 10 years, he said boards really varied a lot. They were there in theory, but the real running of the school was still the principal and the chairperson of the board, or the clergyman who was the chair of the board. Parents were really cast as fundraisers more often, or sidelined into fundraising to some extent. And certainly he describes teachers as being, and he quotes, unenthusiastic about parents' associations. Now actually, if I take my own experience of that, when I was in teacher training college, now you can work out the sums about my age now if you're bored, but I was in teacher training college in between 78 and 81. And when you were on teacher, it really has struck me a number of times on placement. We were in college, there was a lot of talk about the importance of parents, the importance of the home environment and background on the educational development of a child. But when you encountered it in real life in schools, several parents and teachers gave you the distinct impression that it would be better off if the child was given to you at the school gate. And they were afraid of parents, is the truth to be told. Not that they didn't know it was important, but they were afraid of the potential encounter. And that's certainly, you picked it up as a student teacher. Now, the exception to this were schools that were new foundations. Now, I've mentioned Educate Together schools. They were the non-denominational schools. Dalkey Project, North Dublin Project. There were a number of others. And they founded an umbrella body called Educate Together. Gaelscoill are a unique phenomenon, really, in the Irish setting. They are Irish medium schools outside of Irish-speaking districts, because some parents chose for cultural and other reasons, to educate their children through the medium of Irish, even though they are at home English speaking. And it has been quite a strong growth area in the 1980s and 1990s, from a very small base. And I'm mentioning special schools and some new denominational schools here together because they have one thing in common. If you open a new school in Ireland, at least at this period, you had to come up with quite a lot of the funding and quite a lot of the infrastructure yourself, because it was only partially aided by the department. So you got, in fact, if you opened a new school for whatever reason, you had long efforts to get buildings, you had long struggles to get funding, and you ended up creating a spirit of understanding among founding teachers, founding boards, and founding parents. There was a sort of sense of shared enterprise and battle against the system. And that sense of sharing of ideas and sharing of things, be they about buildings, it's very hard if you get really cheek by jowl and working with people together so closely in a struggle, not to move the conversation to other things. And I would certainly have seen that in the school that Robert mentioned in Whitechurch. Whitechurch was a new foundation. I went to it as an assistant teacher about 3 years after it opened. And the woman who founded it, she had an extraordinarily strong vision of what she wanted to do. And she had a hugely committed group of parents that she worked intensely closely with. And it just wasn't an option for us as young teachers not to. It was part of the culture. So that when you actually worked with them, moving to discuss curriculum or how your child was taught was an easy transition. But for most teachers, it's not. It threatens your professionalism as a teacher when you have to defend yourself against somebody who questions. Now, I'm using those words in inverted commas, but that is the fear that you have. I was chatting to somebody outside. How many of you, if you go to the doctor, go in and ask the doctor, now, what actual treatments, range of treatments are you considering before you make up your mind what you're going to recommend for me? You don't. I don't do it. I take what he gives me. And he wouldn't want me to question him, I think. Not so sure. But anyway, I'm not so sure. And the same sort of thing does happen. Whereas in these schools, the atmosphere was different. Now, I mean, one thing that I remember actually taking over when I became principal of the school, the first policy document we decided to do in curriculum terms was the sex education policy. Now, when I think about it, I was mad as principal to start in an area like that, really. Okay? But it was a measure of how mad we were that nobody said I was mad. And in fact, we ended up saying, you know, this is a difficult thing and parents need to know what we'll be actually saying to children. So somebody had the equally mad idea of saying, let's teach the classes and lessons to all the parents first. So we had them all in, and we ran the videos and did the lessons and all the rest of it. I'll never forget, at the end of the session, one woman put up her hand, and I was wondering, what is going to come now? And she said, if you had shown that to me, I wouldn't be here, because I'd never have had a child at all. But, I mean, you know, it was part of that culture. Anyway, so much for the anecdote. Things very definitely changed between 85 and 1990. Partly for a number of reasons. The first I'd say is there has to be political support for something like this at national level. And in succession, there were a couple of ministers who did. Gemma Hussey was one and Mary O'Rourke was another, even though they're from different political traditions. But you ended up in 1991 with a definite statement, Partners in Education, which is still the circular that governs the whole thing. And it was fortunate it came at that time because in economic terms we had started to look at the social partnership model. We had looked to Germany for economic development to try and get us out of an economic mess in the 1980s. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And, but the idea of business, government, community groups and everything, sitting around the table, working out a national wage agreement, which it was to begin with, and then other parts of social policy. And education became exactly the same. And at the same time, we had a huge number of reviews. We had a decade of reviews into education. For our visitors, you'll recognize the OECD as having conducted a review. That's probably one. The others are to do with the curriculum and how schools were run. By green paper and white paper, those are the official terms for a policy document. A green one is one you're just thinking about. A white one is you've more or less made decisions about, but they are policy documents. And all of those, if you track through all of them, there's a strong theme that parents have to be at the center of it. And it gave a real impetus to it. Now, it was fortunate that one of those ministers of education, Gemma Hussey, that I mentioned, had actually given the first funding for the National Parents' Council in 1985. And I think Anne Colgan, who's in the audience, it's funny to have your history in front of you, but Anne would have been, I think, the president at the time, and followed by Fionnuala, or the chief executive, and followed by Fionnuala Kilfeather. But those were terribly important that parents were there at the time. The role of parents, I have to mention special needs parents, or parents of children with special needs. They had a long, bitter struggle to get the rights for their education in the system. And in doing so, they actually galvanized a lot of public opinion to accept the notion of parental involvement. And so you get the legal rights of children to special education being recognized in the Education Act of 1998. And once that happens, then you get proper funding, or at least far, far greater funding for the integration of special needs children in schools. And it would have been inconceivable to write the Education Act without reference to special needs children, but these parents had had a long fight, even through the courts. That's what the Act of 98 did. It actually enshrined partnership approaches. The thing that had gone on in the 1990s in conversation was now part of law. And in fact, our education legislation is interesting in Ireland because it actually says that the minister may make policy about this and that and the other, but he can only do so if he consults. And actually there's a list of bodies and types of people he has to consult, like teachers, managers of schools, and parents are there all the time. And even statutory bodies actually incorporate that tension of partnership within them, like the Curriculum Council, the Special Ed Council, or even my own organisation that can't change the way I do inspections unless I consult. I'd say a last change has come about almost 10 years later, because while we moved very rapidly between 85 and 2000, now, in the last couple of years, another change has happened. Parents are now being consulted about new school openings, but which sort of patron they want, through the patrons themselves, and through changing the patronage of existing schools. Now, that would have been inconceivable in 1985. Just inconceivable. Now, what does this all mean? Well, the first thing, I think, parents bring a really unique perspective to certain areas that really are for the good of the system. Like the Stay Safe programme and the Relationships and Sexuality Education programme would never have had the shape they had but for the input of people from the National Parents' Council. I was on the committee. Sorry, you'll think I'm obsessed with sex education. I'm not, right? But it so happened I was at the NCCA when RSE was being devised. And Fionnuala Kilfeather, who was with the CEO, brought a parent perspective to that was quite unique and did shape a lot of it. You bring a counterbalance to other opinions as well. I mean, policy making can be dominated by that sort of list of people I showed you in the book. But there are other perspectives that have to be brought in, and parents can really bring that. I think you've contributed enormously to the literacy and numeracy strategy, especially about how the assessment balance happens there. And in your work to support junior circle reforms is really, really significant. because it can be difficult for other people to change and difficult for politicians to make decisions to change without support. You're the nearest thing we have to the voice of a child. Some children we can, of course, talk to, and do. But for very young children, or children with very profound special needs, there is no other voice but yours. And I think ultimately, you enhance the responsiveness of the system. Because Irish people do have a strong attachment to the school system, and that's to the good of the system. But that can only last if it's really responsive to what people want and need. And that's a terribly important role that you play. So, I'd say, what are your challenges? One, to keep the meaningful level of engagement going, because that must be a struggle for you. The amount of consultation that you're asked to do. And then, is this national organisation fully reflective of what's on the ground? How does it support the ground, the local associations? And I think one of the biggest challenges you probably have is, can you keep an absolute focus on your own mission? In a partnership process, you see, you start to work with others. You make allies. You get into bed, if you want to use that phrase, with other people to keep the theme going of the evening. All right? But in a sense, you always there is a danger of capture as well. And that's something I think I don't know if you struggle with it, but I think it's something that partnership runs a risk of. Let me turn to the schools. All right. These are quite quick, I promise. Sorry? Robert mentioned this report. I'm going to use two sources of evidence. Robert mentioned this one, which was published by the ERC earlier this week. It's attached to Tim's and Pearls, which is an international survey of reading, maths and science. But I'm just looking at parental views that were collected along the way in 151 schools in Ireland, just to show you where I'm coming from. And the other bit is the surveys that we do as part of whole school inspections. Now, we survey samples of parents as well as samples of students, and the data I'm going to share with you comes from 2010 to 2012, and it's coming from 47,000 questionnaires coming back. So it is a very large database of parental opinion. And I just want to say, the parental questionnaires have a series of statements, and then the parents have to respond: agree strongly, agree, disagree strongly, don't know. So just to understand where I'm coming from. Now look at what the TIM says, first of all, about the views of teachers. This is the teacher view. The principals and teachers believe, they state this themselves, that parental support for achievement was high or very high in Ireland. And 70% of the principals, 60% of the teachers said that. And actually their rates are double those internationally. Now, on one level, that is saying teachers are well disposed to parental involvement, more so perhaps than some of their colleagues in other countries. And that's not a bad starting point. They also thought, and this is a dangerous as well as a good thing, they also thought that parental involvement in their school was high. Look at this. Just to explain, the reds are principals. 44% of them thought that involvement of parents in their school was high, and only 17% of them thought it was low. Now, the figures underneath in red are the other international surveys, Tim's and Pearls. And you can see it's quite higher in Ireland than in other countries in the high space, and more positive in Ireland in the low space. Do you understand the statistics, the way it works? Now, look at the teachers. 46% of them think it's good in Ireland, or high, whereas internationally you're mid-30s. And only 15% think of it as low in Ireland, whereas internationally it's about 20 or a bit over it. Now, that's not a bad space, though it could be a sense of complacency as well, that they think parental involvement is good. But the parents are also positive. They say 92% of the parents agreed that their child's school included them in their education. Not dissimilar to other countries, actually. It's quite high in most countries. And 29% of them felt that the schools did not need to make a greater effort to include them in their child's education. So things are grand for that group. But look at this one, which is the school could do better at keeping me informed of his or her progress. Now, look at the Irish ones on the top. About half of people agree and half disagree. Now, that's not as distributed in the lower one. So, in fact, opinion in Ireland is evenly divided on that, whereas in most countries, it's more positive. Now, that is a challenge for us. And 89% of parents agreed a lot, though, about, these are school climate ones. I mean, they're parents, you are very positive about school climate. The school is safe, that the school cared about their child's progress. But look at the thing about the frequency with which you can talk to the school teacher about the child. In Ireland, you see that it's right over here. 85% really once or twice or 3 times a year at most. Internationally, that would be only 34%. Whereas look here, only 3% of Irish parents meet once or twice a month with their child's teachers, where it's 30% in other countries. Now that is a question for us. And then to turn to the data from the inspections. The school is well run. Now I've put all the statistics, but look at the green area, which is the agrees, all put together. Do you see the way I've done it now, right? Just for simplicity's sake. But 60 strongly agree and 36 agree that the school is well run. The school welcomes parents. A lot of green, though when you think about it, it's 60, 2/3 of people think it's, yeah, really strongly. Only 2/3. I was a bit, given the other things about how we think it's important, is that good enough, I'd be saying. And my child likes school. 96% of parents think their child likes school. Now that's not a bad. If Quinsworth was getting, or Tesco was getting that sort of satisfaction rating, they'd be very happy. Right? And the school provides a safe environment for my child, or my child feels safe, is again not dissimilar. Those are good, solid statistics that any system would be proud of. But look at this one. The school deals well with bullying. Look at how it changes. Right? Look to that. And the most worrying thing is that 24% of parents don't know. Now, for something like bullying, where actually awareness is one of the biggest anti-bullying measures you can have, that's a really worrying statistic. Just as this one is, though, very positive. Look about teaching and learning. Very high numbers are happy with the teaching and learning in the school, with the way the child is doing in the school, with the work the child is asked to do is matched to his or her ability. You're talking about 90% all the time. Do you see that? And the child gets help when they need it. But communication is a different matter. And I think it has things to say for both boards and for you. I know about the work the Board of Management is doing for the school. Look at the difference in the graph. Right? And again, look at the don't knows. So I don't know that I don't know. You know the double whammy there. You could add, in fact, the 3.6, all those disagrees and that could well be lumped together. Now that really does tell something about boards. Parents are invited to contribute views about school policies. Only in about 2/3 of places, really. And the Parents' Association keeps me informed about its work better. And I would have, of course, some schools will not have a Parents' Association. But even so, I think there's still a challenge there. So, what does it tell us? Enormously positive views, I think, about school climate, about teaching, and about learning among parents. But the reporting thing is interesting. I think you have to look at the date in which it was taken. It was taken in 2011, in spring 2011. And then in 2012, as part of the literacy and numeracy strategy, we altered 2 things. Children have to do testing, parents have to get the results of the testing, and they have to get a standardized report. Now, they all date from a year later. I'd like to see that statistic in the next round of Tims and Pearls to see has it helped. And we as inspectors can use that sort of data. Actually, the general picture is interesting here, but it's more interesting when you get it down at school level and you compare the school that you're in as an inspector to what you'd expect to find in the school. And where you get an outlier, you think, there's a question here for the school, there's a question for me as an inspector, to make me think about how good things are really honestly going on here. And that's why it's really important, if you get a questionnaire, you complete it honestly. I'm sorry, I am being the teacher now. Because there is a tendency, I admit, among parents, because it's my school, my child's school, I'm not going to tell those sugar from the department anything that's wrong with it. And we find conversations, in fact, with parents' councils, I'd have to say disappointing sometimes, because they will talk to us glowingly of the strengths of a school, fair enough, but not discuss what they're worried about. Even though the questionnaires are entirely confidential and are machine read. But there's a suspicion in the Irish about that. Schools and parents' associations, you can't be complacent about communication, and I think there are a lot of questions for boards of management. They do have to keep business confidential, but there are lots of things that you can be far more open about. And for teachers, I think you really can't forget the power differential that exists between the teacher and the parent. And you're at a disadvantage as a parent. And teachers don't always realize the depth of that differential. And they have to be sensitive to it. And they have to encourage the awkward question, because actually that's the only way you'll ever improve as a school. And that's what we're trying to do in self-evaluation. Get schools to ask themselves hard questions. Our questionnaires were designed partly to stimulate that, and we're now encouraging schools to do the same thing themselves. We share all that data back with individual schools. They should share it with parents as well. We're supporting them in self-evaluation. And I would say, of course, we have lessons in the department to learn it too, not least about complaints that parents have, and the completely unsatisfactory nature. If you look at the minister's full speech, in fact, he commits in the full speech to amending the legislation so that there can be a charter for parents on how the whole quality agenda between parents and schools can be properly addressed. But you might like to look that up in the speech, Anya. And so lastly, I'd say the positive, the engaged parent-child-teacher relationship can have a really powerful impact on every individual child. And that's the challenge for every single one of us, how to impact positively on that. I think we've made an awful lot of progress in Ireland, and in many, many ways, but we have an awful lot more to do. And one that I think is a really exciting challenge for both us in the department, in the inspectorate, and you right throughout the country. Gurmina Naga.